Buried next to me is Hosea Hudson, who, like Ned Cobb of the Sharecroppers Union, is a forgotten black communist revolutionary born at the turn of the century. In 1898, he was born in Wilkes County, Georgia, to a family of tenant farmers. Now, to be a tenant farmer in the Black Belt means that the land that you work, the soil you till, does not belong to you. That landowner takes that produce to the market, determines the value himself, and subtracts whatever he feels is right for rent from it. If you ever express any desire to move up north to work in the industrial centers, then they file a lien on whatever you were able to save up and to use to buy equipment, because naturally they would have to pay for their own equipment. It was a system called wage slavery. Now, around the 1920s, the price of cotton in the Deep South began to drop and it was no longer a profitable venture. But in Birmingham, Alabama, they discovered coal and were starting to use black labor from the prison systems to mine it. And with the coal discovery came the arrival of trains. Birmingham very quickly became the industrial heart of the American South. You had iron plants, you had textile mills, you had coal mines, and so around 1930, Hosea Hudson packs up his belongings and travels to Birmingham. In 1931 comes the Scottsboro Boys case, and that whole case began when about 24 boys were hoboing from Tennessee to Alabama. A couple of girls get off and run to the police and say that the black boys in the train are fighting the white boys. When the police arrive, the men are now saying that the blacks were trying to assault the white women, so they had to pick the fight. The sheriff immediately realizes that this is about to cause a lynch mob, so to his credit, he takes the 9 Scottsboro boys and puts them inside of the courthouse. And several times, lynch mobs arrived. Around that time, the NAACP sent lawyers who a lot of the more progressives viewed as milquetoast. If you looked at the makeup of the NAACP, they were usually upper middle class, mixed race black people, and that didn't jive too well with a lot of the people who were working class tenant farmers and blacks from the Deep South. But alongside them was the more effective international labor defense, which was a sort of front for Comintern. See, Comintern, based right out of Moscow, short for Communist International, was sending money to the lawyers of international labor defense to defend people like these boys and to defend people like the union organizers who were being targeted by the Pinkertons all across the Deep South. So around this time, people start to look at ILD and look at CPUSA and look at Comintern with a more favorable light. These 9 boys are saved, and Hosea Hudson says that seems really great. Well, he's talking with a couple of employees at the steel factory he's working at, and one of them invites him to a meeting of Communist Party USA. 7 people were present. Initially, Hosea Hudson probably believed it was a Sharecroppers Union meeting because the man was a representative for the SCU, but in reality it was a Communist Party meeting. And none of the people present were literate, which I think is fascinating. And Hosea Hudson said, well, I like what they did for the Scottsboro boys, but I'm totally illiterate. They show him the platform of CPUSA, and he says, you know what? I like that. I think I'm going to join. So at that very meeting, they make him local party leader. Hosea Hudson very quickly learns how to read and begins organizing and doing his job of spreading the word very, very well. So from 1931 to 1933, Hosea Hudson is slowly learning to read and building his ties with local Communist Party organizers. These organizers are attempting to form unions among the employees, but oftentimes don't directly tell the people joining these unions that they are partly funded by a communist organization with its coffers open to Communist International based out of the Soviet Union. And because of this, you've got what are called stool pigeons, informants that sit as a fly on the wall in the bars and pubs that they're having these meetings. Well, in 1933, one of them overhears Hosea Hudson talking about organizing, and he mentions his ties to CPUSA. He's almost immediately fired. Now, what I think is fascinating about this one incident is that his local organizer that was a couple of levels above him said, why don't you call this CPUSA organizer up in New York? He calls that organizer and gets a full name of all of the anti-union informants, brings that back to Birmingham, and starts to distribute them as pamphlets, which he's arrested for in 1933, and what they peg him on is the fact that he attended a meeting of the CPUSA which intended to overthrow the government. So he was put in jail for a time for that, and the 2 men that were dragged in along with him were immediately released. They knew that Hosea Hudson was the main organizer for this sort of revolutionary activity in Alabama. So naturally, by the mid-1930s, Hosea Hudson had a degree of notoriety among the ruling class in the Deep South because he was recognized as this revolutionary organizer. He was constantly harassed by law enforcement, so in 1938, the Communist Party summoned them to their national headquarters in New York. Then they sent him to the leadership training course, where he learned to read and write, because like most black working men in the Deep South, he was totally illiterate. And at that point, he came back to Alabama and founded the Right to Vote Club, because a lot of people assumed even if you were literate, it was illegal to vote while black in the South. This brought him more attention, and all throughout World War II, he still kept organizing these industrial plants in Birmingham because they were vital to the war effort. He founded many local chapters of various unions, and he was incredibly well recognized. And to the federal government, the Bureau of Investigation, and later the FBI, this was a real threat. Because after World War II, he got 26 veterans groups together, and along with an unemployed force, they marched in public and said, what we fought in Nazi Germany was fascism, and we see that right here in America, and we want to fight back against it. So immediately, the FBI put their eye of Sauron directly on Hosea Hudson and began a relentless harassment campaign. Perhaps the biggest tragedy of Hosea Hudson's life is just how hard he fell, because all throughout World War II, the many unions that he helped found local chapters of in Birmingham were viewed as vital to the war effort, and factory men and agricultural workers were encouraged to stick together hand in hand, even including in interracial unions. But in 1944, the Council of Industrial Organizations met in Birmingham and decided not to pick from any of the local black men who made viable candidates. So Hosea Hudson rallied his workers and said, don't vote for CIO candidates if you are a black worker. They had 590 black workers who were basically under Hosea Hudson's command. Now this, coupled with the FBI harassing him, the FBI, at that time the Bureau of Investigation, turned over the fact that Hosea Hudson was a very well-known associate of the former Communist Party USA, because they dissolved during World War II and became more of a social organization. This was turned over to the Ku Klux Klan. This was turned over to local union representatives, and the local 2815, which he himself had founded, blackballed him. They fired him, and for the rest of his life, he could never find stable work because of that. He and his fellow workers that had actually joined with him in the CPUSA were constantly harassed during the Red Scare, and very sadly, in 1946, his wife Lucy, who had been married to him for 30 years, could not take that harassment anymore, and they got a divorce. Now, for the rest of Hosea Hudson's life, and he lived to be 90 years old, only dying in 1988, he remained a devoted communist. And this means, because he was blacklisted, taking menial labor, jobs as janitors, jobs as farmhands. But he never viewed this work as beneath him. And he died an old man here in Gainesville, Florida, much like Ned Cobb, a devoutly religious person, and is buried here in a nearly forgotten black cemetery, which only in recent years has seen a little bit of love and care from local community activists. Now this begins the more sensitive part of the video, which I probably should just leave out, but the Communist Party USA functioned essentially as something which started the civil rights movement along, but because of McCarthyism, people would often accuse these folks of, if you were in a union or you promoted desegregation, you would just be declared a communist as a rule. Now, Martin Luther King had some training from schools that were staffed by people who were members of the CPUSA. Rosa Parks went to a training class that was created by the CPUSA here in Alabama, but after the Civil Rights Movement, the CPUSA, which, as I said earlier, stopped existing during World War II and was only refounded later under different leadership, the only organization that really existed was the NAACP. And the NAACP often wrote out people from history, much like Ned Cobb or Hosea Hudson, in favor of their message of gradual political nonviolent change, which is something that Hosea Hudson would say, that's all well and good. But the only way to get that started is through a more radical means, because nobody was coming down to teach them anything, and the NAACP at that time was only a, what you would call in 2024, hashtag activism. The only people coming down to Alabama were the communists, and they came from New York, and they came from Moscow on orders from Comintern, or Communist International. Hosea Hudson spent the last short period of his life here in Gainesville, Florida, and is buried in the Pine Grove Cemetery. And you can see right over this fence is the white part of the cemetery, where there's quite a few famous graves, but this neglected part of the cemetery is actually very hard to find graves in, so I'll show you right now. He's buried right over here, and because he was close to the dirt road, it seems that his headstone has been pushed down into the sandy soil. Hosea Hudson's buried in the back of the cemetery here in Gainesville, but before I leave, I want to show you the grave of a fallen police officer who died valiantly. His name was Norris Epps Jr., who worked for the Tampa Police Department. On that day, on January 18th, 1995, he and another partner were out on patrol in a helicopter looking for a man whose boat had capsized. The helicopter crashed near the bridge, and Norris Epps died. His partner survived, and Norris was found floating in the water 8 days later. And the cemetery here is sort of typical of segregated black cemeteries along the coast of the American South. You can see all of these graves have concrete slabs above them because there's a lot of flooding during the hurricanes, and we saw during Katrina that oftentimes those bodies would rise up from the ground. As we pan around, a lot of these graves are simple concrete slabs stamped with the names. Oftentimes the die setting is backwards, and in the back of the cemetery here are nameless victims from a local hospital, the Sunland Training Center. At the end of the gravel road there is the main black section of the cemetery here in Gainesville. On the right side of the fence you've got the segregated white side. Of course, now segregation is over for this cemetery and you can be buried wherever you please, but a lot of families choose to be buried where their relatives were for generations, and it's sort of a de facto segregated cemetery. And if you look here, you can see these are all unknowns from the Sunland Training Center, which I believe was a hospital. And it's been years since anyone's been out here in remembrance.